What's up, everybody? Joe here, Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Jag Davies from the Drug Policy Alliance. He is the Communications Strategy Director over there at Drug Policy Alliance. We have a great talk going all over the map, talking about drug policy, what does the Drug Policy Alliance do, the harms of prohibition and criminalization of drug use, talk about some of the great things happening in Portugal. We really go all over the place. Jag has some really cool stuff in the works, including a conference coming up that DPA is helping put on in Atlanta over October 11th through 14th called the Reform Conference, reformconference.org for more info on that. That is going to be really cool. There's also a conference later in the year, I think in University of Washington, might be late October, on End of Life Liberty. End of Life Liberty Project and DPA are putting on this thing about psychedelics and end of life care. So you would also, not only have the ability to control when your life ends, but when and if you choose to use psychedelics around end of life, which is a really big deal. Imagine you could enjoy the last couple months of your life or last couple weeks of your life instead of just being riddled with anxiety and depression. Huge, huge, huge. We get into harm reduction at festivals and parties, university stuff too. We even get into some legal stuff around stop and frisk and how that was a super racist policy tied into marijuana. Yeah, we just really go all over the place and have a great time. The main reason we had him on was to talk about how medicalization and rescheduling of a drug doesn't really mean that it's going to have a change in the legal status of the drug. We have a lot of room left for reform on this stuff. So now for a few announcements. Got a couple breathwork workshops coming up. One on June 4 here in Breck. Also a 3-day kind of residential on June 23, the weekend of that, Friday afternoon to Sunday afternoon. That's going to be really amazing. Some other folks are helping out too, but we're going to do my normal breathwork workshop. Also in Breckenridge, July 8 and August 6. I want to let you also know about Boston. If you're in the Northeast, there's a group Kyle and I both used to facilitate with, June 2 and 3 in Massachusetts. That's Friday through Friday night from 7 to 9, this Saturday, 9 a.m. to 8. Check that out at bostonholotropic.com. For more info on my events, you can check out Psychedelics Today on the events page or breckbreath.com, BRECKBREATH.com. Keep a lookout for more announcements coming out about our new improved psychedelic integration and self-care class. We're going to have a lot to say about that over the next month. And if you want to learn more, sign up on the email list or check us out on Facebook and you'll catch all the action and discussion there. And I believe that's it for now. Thank you all for your time and see you on the next episode. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome back to the show. Today we have Jag Davies, who is the Communications Strategy Director for the Drug Policy Alliance, a very important organization in our world, and Jag's doing some great work. Jag, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me today on Psychedelics Today.
Psyched. Really happy to have you here. We first touched base on Twitter. I don't know what I was doing, but I was talking to somebody about how I believed that criminal penalties would go down as soon as legalization for prescription would happen for psychedelic drugs, and you caught that right away and said, nope, that's a pretty typical misconception, and there's really nothing to say changing of schedule would impact penalties. And let's maybe dig into that. What's going on there?
Yeah, it raises so many interesting questions. Because, I mean, the medical system in our country is so limited in some ways. When a drug is FDA approved, it's FDA approved for a particular use. And what psychedelic researchers are trying to do now is to which is fantastic, don't get me wrong, is to, just has its limitations, is to get a certain protocol for psychedelic-assisted therapy approved, where if you are in a government-supervised, government-sanctioned, medically supervised facility with therapists, you could use certain psychedelics as part of the therapy, but that wouldn't change any of the criminal penalties for using it outside of that setting, outside of the regulated system. Quite a lot of heavily criminalized drugs, I mean, cocaine, methamphetamine, ketamine have medical uses, are in schedules 2 or 3. And of course, prescription opioids have been very heavily criminalized, have very severe mandatory minimums in a lot of places, even though they're not Schedule 1. So, I mean, for example, with marijuana, DPA's position is that it should be descheduled, basically taken out of the Controlled Substances Act altogether, because none of the schedules are an appropriate place. But it really highlights the need. I mean, on some level, what we really need is to scrap the whole drug scheduling system and come up with a new one that allows for substances that have a human history of use, that are relatively safe, but that don't have a very easily identifiable medical use to be safely accessible in some way. Because, of course, with any illegal drug, they're generic. I mean, that's part of the reason no pharmaceutical company is going to spend millions of dollars to put marijuana through FDA clinical trials when it's a generic plant. That, besides for the fact that the government has been very obstructive with marijuana research, but and the same thing goes for MDMA or other substances. And the only way MAPS and Hefter have been able to do, which is amazing, is through nonprofit fundraising. But that's not really, feasible with all drugs. But what is happening, irrespective of a drug schedule, as we've seen with marijuana, the criminal penalties for it can be reduced and even eliminated. And so, we're really trying to, at DPA, take a more holistic approach that also addresses ending the criminalization of people who use psychedelics. That's actually not that far-fetched politically. A lot of jurisdictions in the U.S. have policies in place to divert low-level drug offenders, and there's, at least 60 supermajority support for, ending the prosecution of people who use any illegal drug. The best example is Portugal internationally, where they ended the criminalization of all drugs, including psychedelics, in 2001. And since then, drug use has gone down among young people, but overdoses, AIDS, have gone drastically down. And because people are able to get help through the health system when they're ready for it. The thing is that's tricky, I think, for a lot of people who are passionate about psychedelics, is that, from a political standpoint, there's actually not a huge benefit in separating out psychedelics. Psychedelics support for legalizing them is not any better than support for legalizing heroin or methamphetamine. So all of the attention on its medical uses hasn't changed people's assumptions about, legally regulating them more broadly. But what people do support is removing, reprioritizing law enforcement and public health resources around drugs more generally. And so, in the broader scope of the drug war, there's thousands and tens of thousands of people arrested for MDMA and psychedelics every year, there's 1.5 million arrests in the country altogether for drugs, and almost all of those are just drug possession. And so, psychedelics are a relatively small part of the overall drug war, but those harms of people getting arrested and people feeling unsafe to be able to use psychedelics fall disproportionately on people who are young and in more vulnerable situations, people from marginalized communities, where they're more likely to have a police interaction, or more likely to feel like their safety is in danger. So I think it's important for people who are passionate about psychedelics to advocate for, reducing the role of criminalization of psychedelics outside of the medicalization model. In addition to it, it's a complementary approach. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But I mean, if you look, I mean, if you go back in history and you look at every system of drug control we've had, it's always been racialized and stratified by class. I mean, going back to the late 1800s, when Chinese immigrants who smoked opium were criminalized, and when the first anti-drug laws were passed, or the early 1900s when Mexican American people were criminalized for using marijuana when the first marijuana laws were passed. At the same time, there was a system for, white middle class people who were addicted to opiates to get, opiates through the medical system. And they were sort of considered victims, if anything. They weren't considered scapegoats. And you go all through history, and who has access to prescription drugs in the medical system has always been based on class and based on race. And so I think if the psychedelic advocacy movement isn't explicitly anti-racist and coming from a clear social justice perspective, ultimately it's going to perpetuate the system we've had historically in the U.S., where, well-off white people have good access to legal drugs and everyone else is heavily punished for them. You see this dynamic in places that have legalized marijuana to some degree, where, like in Colorado, marijuana arrests have gone way down across the board of everyone, but the people who are still getting arrested are young Black and brown people, homeless people who are more likely to have interactions with the police because public smoking isn't legal. Sorry. And so if you don't reform a policy with those dynamics in mind of which groups benefit and which groups are left out, then given the society that we're in, it's going to fall into the default one. So, I mean, for example, with marijuana legalization now, a lot of our battle is around not whether marijuana will get legalized, but how it gets legalized. We were very happy with what came out of California last year, where we helped draft and fund Proposition 64 there, and it has a lot of explicit measures written into it that provide some sort of atonement and reparations for the harm has been done on certain communities by the drug war. So some of the tax revenue will be reinvested in those communities, and a lot of the tax revenue gets reinvested in education in low-income neighborhoods. And there's provisions built in to try to limit the degree of big businesses coming in right away. And it also has resentencing provisions in it because, okay, you think about it now, all of a sudden marijuana is legal and you have, all these wealthy white people mostly investing in it. And then what about all the people who were marijuana entrepreneurs the past 20 or 30 years who, ended up with felonies on their record?
Right.
They're cut out. 'Cause I mean, historically, going back over the past 20 years, almost all of the medical marijuana measures would exclude people with felonies on their record from participating in the legal market. So it ends up with this really ironic situation where the people who have suffered the most harms of prohibition and have a lot of expertise in marijuana entrepreneurship are cut out of the gains that are had. So that is going to be a constant ongoing battle in the coming years and decades, really, to ensure that marijuana legalization is done in a equitable way. It could play out in a lot of different ways. So that's going to be part of the fight going forward.
There's this analogy I hear once in a while, statement. What is it? The future is here now, just unevenly distributed. And I'm seeing it in poor populations. Well, in Colorado, right, it's kind of expensive to obtain recreational or medical marijuana, and it's cheaper to buy from the black market in a lot of ways still. Underprivileged people are acquiring it that way, so exposing themselves not only to simple possession and smoking in public, but through illegal acquisition means. And there's veteran groups really pushing hard for access because, a lot of veterans are very poor welfare, or maybe not even be pulling welfare because they don't think they deserve it. So they're probably putting themselves at risk in similar ways. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, it seems very complex. Do you know how, like, in terms of like the racism and with the drug war, what are the arrests like in Portugal? Is it still targeted with minorities or underprivileged people? Have you ever researched into any of that?
Well, they're not making any arrests for drug possession anymore. Like no
Right.
one
Okay.
is brought into, even for public drug use. I mean, no one is forced into they what they do. It's an interesting system, and having universal health care helps. But they refer you to what they call it's translated as a quote unquote dissuasion commission, where you have the option voluntarily of going in and meeting with, a therapist and a few different experts from different service providers from different fields. And if you want help or access to any services, they kind of let you know what's available to you. But they don't, if you don't come into that meeting, they don't then come and arrest you like they would in the US if you're on parole and miss a meeting or something.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. With drug trafficking, I'm not sure. That's one of the sort of devil in the detail kind of things. Some countries have decriminalized drugs to some degree, but the threshold limit is very low. And so the police can basically take anyone they want and call them a drug trafficker, even if they had a tiny amount on them, because it's up to their discretion.
Wow.
And so, yeah, then it does end up perpetuating the same system. So, and hasn't been very effective. I mean, even in New York, where I've been living the past few years, New York passed a marijuana decriminalization law in 1977,
Right.
mostly by, an effort led by white parents who were, tired of, their like high school age kids, getting arrested and ending up in the jail, in sketchy circumstances. And for like 20 years or 15 years after 1977, there were barely any marijuana arrests in New York, just like in the hundreds a year. But then when stop and frisk and broken windows and all that stuff happened in the 90s and 2000s, marijuana arrests shot up because there was a provision in the law that if marijuana was in quote unquote public view, then it was still a misdemeanor. And so in poor neighborhoods and black and brown neighborhoods, the police would go around stopping and frisking people and making them take the marijuana out of their pocket, and then it's in public view and arresting them. So that's the point where there were up until a few years ago, like 50,000 arrests a year just for marijuana possession, just in New York City, and almost all young black and Latino men between 18 and 25. It's like taking a whole generation and branding them for life as criminals and cutting them out of the system. And now, I mean, de Blasio ran on a platform of improving that, the current mayor of New York. And it's down to like 15,000 a year, but that's still massive. And it's still all in, black and brown communities. I mean, it's like the marijuana arrests in the white communities in New York City are like zero. And it's the same thing in other, very liberal cities. You look at Seattle or San Francisco or Portland, these cities we think of as being very progressive in a lot of ways. They often have some of the highest, disproportionate rates of arrests for drugs between black and white people. So it's a very like entrenched system we're going up against. But at the same time, I mean, I'm kind of shocked. I've, been doing, in the time I've been doing this kind of work, public opinion has changed a lot, where now you have 60-something% support for ending arrests of all people who use drugs. But the political system is always like slow to catch up. And
Right.
But at almost all criminal justice policies are at the local and state level. Like 90-something% of law enforcement is, state and local law enforcement. The federal government has like limited. That's how even, the federal government forever, through the Clinton and Bush and even the beginning of Obama was totally against medical marijuana and trying to shut it down, but it was able to survive anyway. So, we're at a moment now of having to play a lot of defense federally, but I think the cat's out of the bag to a large degree with marijuana legalization. What is more in question is what will happen with broader criminal justice reforms that impact more marginalized people. One of the top reasons for deportations is marijuana possession and drug possession. Marijuana possession, in the last years we had data available, was the fourth most common criminal cause of deportation.
Wow.
And a lot of times this could be an old thing from 10 or 20 years ago. There's stories from Colorado of people in a legal marijuana state getting deported for having a prior marijuana conviction,
Jeez.
So it's, the broader criminal justice policies are definitely suffering a setback in some ways. But a lot of states are also, even in conservative states, I mean, in Louisiana right now, in Texas, there's big criminal justice reform bills. I mean, a lot of the southern states have passed criminal justice reforms over the past few years, sort of the strange bedfellow of like financial conservatives and libertarians and social justice, progressives. And it's, there's sort of even a political consensus that sentencing reform and, at least scaling back mass incarceration is the sensible thing to do. Majorities of Republicans support sentencing reform, or at least some forms of it. You had during the Republican presidential debates last year, you had, Jeb Bush and other candidates sort of saying, oh, we can't arrest our way out of the drug problem, and saying things that were like surprisingly reasonable, sort of, and the shame, of course, is that the one person who was really, really retrograde on it is the one who got elected, and has appointed like the worst of the worst. So it's kind of a very paradoxical moment where we have all this momentum in some ways, and then sort of like the most, like, we could not have like sat around and dreamt this up of, just the worst of the worst drug warriors in the cabinet right now.
What's your take on that? Or do you think there's actually going to be a little bit of pushback or backward motion?
Yeah, there's definitely backward motion. I mean, to some degree, like with a lot of other issues, the reforms under Obama have been overstated in the media. A lot of the headlines recently have been, Jeff Sessions wants to bring back the war on drugs, and, implying that it had gone away, and drug arrests are pretty much near their all-time high. Incarceration for drugs has gone down very slightly, which is pretty incredible because it was skyrocketing for so long, but it's still near its all-time high. Obama's budgets never really prioritized a public health approach over a criminal justice approach. So it was still, his rhetoric was pretty incredible sometimes, really addressing like the harms of mass incarceration, and he said some sensible things about marijuana, that it's not more harmful than alcohol, which should be common sense. That is something the vast majority of the public agrees with.
Right.
But for a sitting president to say it was pretty cool. But it wasn't like there was that big a shift. It was actually, we had huge bipartisan, sentencing reform was actually the one issue in Congress. It still is. It's one of the few issues that the Democrats and Republicans can agree upon. And it was actually Jeff Sessions in the Senate last year who was the main opponent to sentencing reform and was able to shut it down. But overall, we're moving in the right direction. Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of our work too is also, so DPA's goal is reducing the role of criminalization in drug policy and instead implementing a health-based approach. So a lot of our work is also on, actually envisioning what that health-based approach would look like. So, the just thinking about the Trump thing, the opioid epidemic is very interesting, where you had that got a lot of like people who otherwise wouldn't be supportive of drug policy reform on board, it was affecting more well-off white communities.
Right.
The sort of image of the heroin user changed in the public's eye. But at the same time, now you have, Trump sort of claiming that, it's the evil Mexicans bringing opioid into the communities and sort of like tying it together into his broader rhetoric. So that's, that's something we're very concerned about. One of the best things for drug policy is having access to universal health care. That would drastically make treatment accessible to anyone who wants it. That is just like so cost effective, and so sensible. But most people can only access it through the criminal justice system, which is a very like counterproductive approach. So I mean, part of what we're doing around psychedelics is trying to mainstream and help scale up harm reduction services around psychedelics. A lot of the worst harms of prohibition happen where people are using psychedelics in public settings that can be a bit more chaotic and threatening in different ways, or where they're more likely to have an encounter with law enforcement. So that's universities, schools, particular, nightlife venues and festivals. So we have something called the Safer Partying campaign that's working on, implementing that work. And I think that's kind of like softening the ground to some degree without actually changing any of the laws. A lot of the worst, a lot of people do get arrested at these festivals. It's just normal. People just assume, oh, you're taking 50, 100 people in, on any given festival. And that disproportionately affects young people, because they're the ones who are usually at those festivals and usually more likely to be searched. And it leads to more risky drug taking behavior, like taking all your drugs before you go through security, or waiting and buying something on site instead of testing it beforehand. Or not having access to. A lot of countries in Europe have, like Portugal, have very wide and government sanctioned access to drug checking services, where you can at least, even if you don't have, legally regulated drugs, at least you can test them to make sure certain impurities aren't in them. And so we're trying really hard. We really want to get that started in the U.S. There's a lot of obstacles.
A really cool idea that I think is in place in Switzerland, maybe some places in Portugal, but is these portable vans for drug testing that include mass spectrometers. Dance Safe and Bunk Police, I think, are working on getting those kinds of services. Thing with mass spectrometers that people might not know is that I think it's the only good way to test for fentanyl, something that's so powerful in such small doses. Like you can't really test if it's mixed in with your drug or not. So one of the better ways to be safe. Have you heard anything about that mass spectrometry stuff?
Yeah, I mean, they're just really expensive as well.
Right.
I don't even know the price. It's probably a good idea to know that.
Yeah, it's I think prohibitive, for sort of small groups. But I think institutions where they would be located might be reticent about having people bring drugs there. It's kind of, criminalization has all kinds of like knock-on effects where even just the threat, is enough to sort of like limit institutions' buy-in.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. That whole Rave Act, we've talked about it a little while, where the organization and business owner, whoever, is legally liable if they're not shutting down drug use.
Yeah, that had a real chilling effect on nightlife harm reduction. I mean, the interesting thing is that it's really been just a chilling effect. It hasn't no one's actually been prosecuted under it because it's on pretty like shaky legal grounds. But just for some reason it became like this boogeyman. There are a lot of festivals that are doing harm reduction work. I mean, one of the biggest ones of the transformational festival world, Lightning in a Bottle, we're working really closely with them. They have send out harm reduction messages beforehand that we work on with them. And, I don't think they don't allow drug checking. That's,
I'm kind of curious if you are doing harm reduction at festivals, how is that different than, say, the Zendo project? What Max is
we
doing?
work with the Zendo project.
Oh, you work with them. Okay.
We include each other in what we do. That, it's really trying to mainstream and what that model, basically, that you should have mental health services, or, that should be one of the things that is, sort of standard for event producers. And that is just commonsensical. I mean, you're less likely to have problems that end up in the media or end up drawing attention from the wrong people if you, just acknowledge that, people are inherently going to have difficult experiences. And you need to be able to deal with them. I mean, Zendo, it's interesting, a lot of the people they deal with are not on psychedelics, but are just, having a mental health issue, or just, they didn't sleep for too long, they got lost, or had some kind of break where they needed, some emotional support or just a place to lie down. So yeah, it makes sense from a event producer's standpoint to have that. Yeah.
Do you see any ever pushback from the event producers of, with that rave act over looming, of being is that kind of supporting drug abuse? Or drug use at a festival, and they don't want people there? You ever see that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they don't want to come off as condoning or supporting drug use. And, even Burning Man has been very careful over the years. When I worked at what they called the precursor, it was called Sanctuary back in 2005 and 2006. It was technically unsanctioned by the Burning Man organization. They were really nervous about us doing it and didn't want us talking about it publicly. So yeah, I mean, the trick would be, actually, if there's any insurance people listening, to find an insurance person for festivals who gets that, it's actually the company's going to be less liable to put in a claim, because the event producers always blame it on the insurance companies.
Interesting.
Which I don't know how much truth there is in that completely, but you would think, even from an insurance company's perspective, they want to have services that are going to ensure people don't die, and that people have a good time, or just basic stuff, that there's free water accessible. A lot of times it's very, very basic stuff, or just some chill out space. Yeah, even if they don't have a mass spectrometer there, although that would be ideal. In Portugal, at the Boom Festival there, they publicize the results. So they have a big projector screen where they post what's in the drug. If there's a bad batch of something, they'll post it up, and send it out on Twitter, So, I mean, that's always just been fascinating to me. That I think it shows, I guess, the background of people who are interested in psychedelic research generally come from a more privileged background.
Right.
These people are open about their interest in psychedelic research publicly, and is that generally people don't seem to be that worried, number one, about being a criminal per se. People just assume, I'm not going to get caught for that, or they kind of made their peace with the system, or they think that, the only other alternative is complete free market legalization, and we don't want that, obviously, either, where it gets totally out of control and is marketed, by Pfizer or whatever. I think that there's just been a limited set of options available. And I think even people, it's just interesting how we internalize our own oppression in some ways, where, I mean, most people who come to psychedelic research events generally want to be able to use psychedelics outside of a medically supervised setting and have had beneficial experiences in those settings. and want that as well. I think there's an assumption that it'll happen automatically on its own, and I think we can't assume that. Now's a really important moment. I mean, what could happen is once psychedelic therapy becomes legal, a lot of the people funding psychedelic research who are well off are like, hey, I got mine. And, the movement could actually, there'd be less urgency in some ways, less funding available to, I think it's very important at this point where there's all this interest and the movement is still sort of setting its agenda to be sure that there's like complementary approaches outside of medicalization. And even if you're just interested from a purely scientific research perspective, you're not sure about psychedelics. I'm assuming a lot of people listening to this show are enthusiasts about psychedelics in one way or another. But even if you're just curious about their research potential, research is still incredibly limited by the whole sort of drug war context that we're in. I mean, it's amazing that these people doing psychedelic research have been able to get their clinical trials done and to fund them and get them approved through all these institutions, but they are walking a tightrope. It's been really hard to do what they do. It was only through decades of, playing it safe and working their way up that they've got to this point. There's a lot of questions in research that are not being answered. In academia tends to be inherent. The people in it tend to be more liberal, but it tends to be conservative in a lot of ways. And so ultimately, the whole decision making around how research gets done needs to be changed. Like right now, the DEA still decides who gets a license and who doesn't. Their job is drug enforcement, and they're a very politicized agency. That should be like science and health agencies that determine who gets, a license to be able to do research. There's a lot of things that can't be done outside of the placebo-controlled, double-blind paradigm that, in order for something to be considered a medicine in the U.S., it's just very, very limited. I mean, when the DEA says psychedelics and marijuana don't have medical uses, they're actually technically correct because, we've decided generally that the FDA decides what is a safe and approved medicine, but only certain drugs have the incentives to be put through this very specific set of clinical trials that are required to get them approved for prescription use and get that safe and effective tag from the FDA. So ultimately, I mean, we should. In New Zealand a few years ago, they passed a bill to create a new commission that would regulate synthetic drugs, where a company, if they had drugs that on the market that they wanted to sell, they had to pay for the safety testing to prove that it was safe, and then they could bring it to market. And funnily enough, the bill never ended up getting enacted because it required animal studies as part of the safety tests, and animal rights activists, which I consider myself an animal rights supporter as well, so I don't know where I come on this one, but animal rights activists ended up like scuttling it because it required animal trials in order to prove its safety with these new synthetic drugs. But ultimately, we kind of need like a new FDA that, has that basic concept for what we call recreational drugs, or drugs, even things that aren't necessarily recreational, but, I mean, there's so many things like kava or, kratom or kratom, however you say it, which is now starting to face criminalization. That's used by millions of people. There's so many different things that don't fit into that model and don't have an incentive to be put through FDA clinical trials.
Do you have any news about the Kratom update? Like what's going on with that right now?
I wish I had some recent news to report. I mean, so what happened last year was that the DEA tried to emergency schedule it.
I remember that, yeah.
DEA and tons of different groups and people fought back, and it was the first time the DEA actually withdrew an emergency scheduling. The battle now is at the state level because, like I was saying earlier, most criminal justice policies are made at the state level. So there's 5 or 6 states that have already criminalized kratom at the state level, and a bunch more states had introduced bills this year that most of them were killed because there is a real community out there of people who care about kratom who are really on top of this stuff. And it's a big industry too. I was like the point person at DPA trying to figure out our response, and I didn't realize the American Kratom Association estimates 3 to 5 million people use it. I'm like, wow. I mean, I knew it was a lot, but we didn't know there was such a huge community out there. And part of the danger is that sort of the abstinence only model, because people just assume that oh, you're just switching from one drug to another, and I think that's sort of like a model, this framework that just like refuses to die, the abstinence only thing. We're also there's all this data coming out about how marijuana is helping people get off opiates or cut back on their opiate use. A lot of time, like states that have medical marijuana have lower rates of opioid overdoses because people are at least like cutting back on their opioids, if not putting them all together with medical marijuana. And psychedelics, of course, and kratom are also, there's studies going on looking at the association there as well.
I remember watching a documentary on YouTube somewhere, but I think the place was in Maine. It was like a little retreat center, and their whole thing to help people get off of opiates was like high doses of cannabis, just like lots of dabs, smoking nonstop to produce almost like an uncomfortable effect. And over, I'm guessing people stayed there for a few months, but thought that was a really interesting concept. I'm sure, people probably pretty controversial of switching one substance to another substance.
Yeah, I think it depends how it's done. I mean, a lot of treatment of what we call quote unquote treatment in this country is very ineffective and scientifically unproven. That's the thing. Even like when the government devotes resources to, sort of the public, quote unquote, public health approach, it's still very limited because most of the treatment is through the criminal justice system anyway, they're putting money to it's like DARE and, these program, this sort of like just say no approach that's discredited and unrealistic. So yeah, it's not just a matter of like getting a public health approach, but actually like a real public health approach that's based on evidence and not sort of ideology.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about what if psychedelics are, used more broadly in our society once you branch out. The therapists that have done the research studies so far are a pretty small, relatively small, tight-knit group, and as because they've done it in stage 1 and stage 2 of FDA clinical trials. They're about to start stage 3, which is hundreds of people in much larger amounts, and where there's dozens of therapists and lots of sites, and then eventually once it's if it is made more widely available, how the cultural association with it changes. People tend to assume that I think people have this assumption that psychedelics make people more open-minded or politically liberal. And there was actually a study about that came out recently, and that showed there was a correlation there. But, they said in the study that they accounted for, variables. But in an online survey, I don't know if that's really possible, given like, where are you sampling from, and I think the cultural expectations that people have are very are the most important factor in the experience itself. There was a article that came out on Symposia today by Nicholas Langlitz, who's a really interesting anthropologist, about a study that was done with mescaline in the late 19th century, where they gave it to a group of European Americans and then they gave it to a group of Native Americans, and they had completely opposite experiences, where the European Americans had like hellish experiences and described it as being pretty dreadful in general, and whereas the Native Americans had felt a connection with a higher power, and yeah, that has everything to do with your association with it. So I think that goes back to removing by removing the criminalization of psychedelics, that will help change the image of who is a psychedelic user, and who can be open about their psychedelic drug use. I mean, one of the best things, for changing public opinion is people who are functioning drug users to come out about their use. But certain groups of people have it easier doing that than others. I mean, for a lot of people, your job, your family, to keep, you could lose your kids, over something like that, in a lot of places. And so, not everyone can do that. But it needs to be done in a responsible way. I mean, it's the same thing. I think people who are enthusiastic about psychedelics often, I find, harbor a lot of misperceptions about people who use other substances, or create sort of like a dualism of like good drugs and bad drugs, and these aren't, or they aren't even drugs. It's something else, where that's not really helpful. And I mean, for example, I always like to point out when I give a talk in front of audiences about psychedelics that 9 out of 10 people who try heroin or methamphetamine or crack cocaine don't go on to get addicted and have problems. That's according to the federal government's own data. And it's similar with psychedelics. We don't ever see those people who are a functional heroin user or a functional methamphetamine user who use a bit once or twice a month on a weekend. You don't hear their stories generally, because they're not, right. The stigma is so great that why would you volunteer that information? The only stories you hear of people who've really hit rock bottom, and where they're exposed. And so whether or not someone even is perceived as having a problem with drugs depends so much on their status. If you're in a socioeconomically marginalized situation, one small arrest or one crazy night out partying that went wrong, or can totally destroy your whole life, your job, your family. Where for a lot of other people, if you're you have a bit of a buffer. There's always been good legal access to drugs for well-off white people.
For instance, we have prescription crystal meth. Dr. Carl Hart kind of pointed this out online a while ago, that Adderall is almost identical to crystal meth. It's just, pumped out in a different facility. That said, people making it out of brake fluid and batteries, that's a little dicey. But so actually,
which is the harm of prohibition.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Can we talk about the Office of Academic Engagement at DPA briefly? Yeah,
sure. My colleague, Julie Netherland here, a couple years ago, started DPA's Office of Academic Engagement, which does a couple different things. One, it provides sort of resources to academics to help them become more engaged with policymaking and with tools to help make their work more public. DPA actually has a bit of an academic history to it, because we were more of a think tank when we started. Founded by a Princeton professor in the early 90s as the Linda Smith Center, as more of a think tank, and gradually in the late 90s, early 2000s became a political advocacy organization. But we always, really prioritize a sort of rigorous academic quality to our work, and working closely with academics, who care about the issues we do, because there are a lot of the people on the front lines who are out there, like our board member, Dr. Carl Hart. A good thing to know about for all you out there is we are organizing our biennial conference, the International Drug Policy Reform Conference right now, which is October 11th to 14th in Atlanta. And that is an amazing conference. When I first went to that back in 2005, it was sort of a life-changing event for me in connecting psychedelics with all these other different movements going on with formerly incarcerated people working on organizing, and harm reduction people, and people from all over the place at every level of society. And I organized the psychedelics track for the Reform Conference. And in past years, we've had really interesting sort of panels with maps and with people, a lot of psychedelic researchers, but also people working on psychedelics from different angles. And we really, it's not just people giving an hour-long academic presentation. A lot of people there are academics, but we organize it in a way to foment debate and discussion, where it's more of a roundtable conversation than people sort of speaking at you and reading from a paper for an hour. So I highly encourage people to check that out in Atlanta. We're also doing a conference on psychedelics and palliative care with the University of Washington's Law School in Seattle 2 weeks after that on October 27th. So NAU in the Northwest, check that out.
Sounds awesome.
I'm kind of close to a palliative care doctor and tried to bring up this psychedelic impact to people at end of life, and it was not accepted well. So I'll probably pass this along because I think it's because, you're not a doctor. What do you know? Shut up, idiot. Yeah. It's like, oh, come on. Like, listen, I've been studying this stuff for a long time, more time than you spent in drug school. I mean, medical school. And it's a weird thing. And I'm glad you guys are doing that. Is that a DPA sponsored conference?
Yeah, it's co-organized by DPA and a group called the End of Life Liberty Project. They were one of the main groups who have fought and won for right to die litigation in a number of states, I think including Colorado.
That just happened, I think.
Yeah, and she sort of, after working on that for a while, it's sort of, if you have a right to die, you should also have a right to live to your fullest, at least if in no other time in your final moments. So in a lot of ways, that's one of the more politically acceptable options to people at the end of life. I mean, it's pretty normal to give people morphine then, and sedate them. If we're able to do that, we may as well give them a chance to experience psychedelics.
What's that conference called again?
It is called, I can't remember the name right now. Let me look real
quick. No
quick.
problem. I was just Googling all over. There's obviously a lot of websites on this.
Psychedelics and palliative care and the University of Washington and the Drug Policy Alliance. You'll find us. And also, we're very active on all of the interwebs, on Twitter and Facebook, and Snapchat now, even.
Ooh, Snapchat, nice.
Oh, really? I'm excited. I'm adding you right now.
Right here.
Yeah, I'm starting to actually enjoy it way more than Instagram or Facebook, to be honest.
Oh, cool.
Finally. There's something
I'm
else.
Active on Twitter these days, so you can find me there.
I do need to do Twitter more. It's awesome. There's so much actual debate happening.
I find out a lot about a lot of interesting people doing interesting work in very specific fields that I didn't know about otherwise.
Yeah. Do you have any advice on maybe students or anybody that wants to get involved in any policy work or just helping with reforming drug policy and psychedelics? And
I would say, look at, if you feel like getting involved on a personal level, look at the groups in your area who are doing organizing around criminal justice and harm reduction, and who the the people, the boots on the ground are who've been doing that work for years. I mean, there's some places where there's not much, but there are a lot of just about every town and city in the country, has really interesting criminal justice organizing going on now, and get involved with them, and bring up the issue of psychedelics and getting that community, finding ways to get that community on board. I think it's easy. I go to a lot of psychedelics conferences and a lot of conferences on broader drug policy reform issues, and it's surprising there's barely any overlap. There is some overlap, but it's very small of the people who are there. We tend to get ourselves into silos. So, if you care about psychedelics, go to a harm reduction conference or get involved with the local harm reduction group, or the local criminal justice reform organizing, or the local. In a lot of places, marijuana is still heavily criminalized, and there's a lot of very important work going on around ending marijuana arrests. Most marijuana arrests are still near an all-time high. There's still 42 states to go. And even in the states where it is legal, there's still issues. So I think focusing at the local level is where you can have the most impact in a lot of ways. But yeah, I hope more generally, I hope that people who care about psychedelics get more invested and involved in ending the criminalization of psychedelics more broadly, and avoid thinking of that as sort of something we do 10 or 20 years from now or someone else's issue. I think a lot of people in the psychedelic research field are very reticent to talk about, they have good reason to be very careful about not associating themselves with a political movement. That's how in some ways, that's how they've been able to get their psychedelic research approved, is by playing it straight within these mainstream institutions and not, associating themselves with like the marijuana legalizers or whoever. But the political reality, where 10 or 20 years ago was very different from the way it is now. And I think ultimately for people who care about psychedelic research, it will help their cause to get engaged politically and to build a broader base of support. Because the groups of people, I feel like it's a lot of an echo chamber among people who are interested in psychedelics to a large degree.
Absolutely.
And I'm in a bit of a bubble, so I probably my own sense of reality is kind of warped. And like, of course, it would feel that way to me. Is I think that's where there's the most opportunity.
Cool, Jag. I want to run this quick story by you about what's happening here in where I live. There is a district attorney who has this quote unquote tough on drugs stance. He ostensibly is doing some restorative justice stuff, but I think it's all political moves. There was a case that so when he was running for re-election recently, got called out in this event for having gone, I don't know if it was on the record, but saying publicly, anybody who legally consumes marijuana through recreational medical means should give up their driver's license.
Wow.
So obviously, I'm a little awkward around him. I don't really want to engage him because he said something like that publicly. And then to next level, there was a recent court case. Someone died. Apparently somebody who wanted to, he's probably on his way out anyway, just from substance abuse all over the map. He was looking for a way out, is what I've heard. He smoked a fentanyl patch and died.
Jeez.
He texted somebody and said, "How do you do this?" The gentleman told him how, but said, "Be very careful, and because this could kill you." This person that he texted was brought up on manslaughter charges.
Oh, yeah.
For a text, even though it said this can kill you. And he was acquitted, obviously, but the fact that this particular person, the district attorney in particular, was willing to bring charges to somebody like this blows my mind. And this is Colorado, right? This isn't, theoretically, I'm feeling like this is a progressive place, but this is the Wild West open carry everywhere. Kind of a wild place. Still a lot of people hate marijuana here, even though it's this, big revenue thing for the state. I don't know. Any commentary on that whole thing?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, quote unquote, nominally progressive states are a lot of the worst ones on criminal justice more broadly. Right. And yeah, we've been doing a lot of work around opposing these new quote unquote drug-induced homicide laws. Yeah, this is where there's been this huge opportunity where we've been able to pass a lot of good reforms and harm reduction measures as a result of the attention on the opioid crisis. But then at the same time, there's simultaneously like this backlash, of people wanting to respond to it with like more criminalization and like demonizing quote unquote drug dealers, who are usually just small time petty, quote unquote petty dealers who are users themselves, who are just supporting their habit, And yeah, that's something we have to be really on guard against with the opioid crisis, is not falling back into the old patterns of demonizing, assuming that all the evidence over decades shows that cracking down on through enforcement does nothing to limit the supply. People are going to get it from somewhere. All it does is make it much more dangerous for everyone involved, and lock up ridiculous amounts of people. But yeah,
enforcement only makes it more dangerous.
And there's actually been a very positive trend in criminal justice reform just the past couple years of progressives getting involved in district attorney elections and getting good district attorneys. A civil rights lawyer was just won the Democratic primary in Philadelphia, and will be the next DA of Philadelphia, who has made a career out of suing the police department in Philadelphia. Because, part of judges get blamed a lot in the war on drugs, but it's actually the prosecutors who have all the power. The war on drugs and mass incarceration has been a massive shift of judicial power to prosecutorial power. More than like 95% of people behind bars for drugs did not go through a trial and were found guilty. They pleaded guilty because they have these crazy mandatory minimums on the books. People get threatened by the prosecutors of all the power. They threaten these people with, look, you can go to trial, but I'm going to throw the book at you and give you, 30 to life. Or you can take a 5 or 10 year plea deal or whatever. Everyone's going to take the plea deal because they have like very little chance of winning in the trial, because everything is stacked against them, especially if they don't have money to pay for a lawyer, which is most people in the system at that point. So yeah, the district attorneys in the country could end mass incarceration tomorrow, and it's an elected office. There's just this like knee-jerk reaction that like, oh, I have to be tough on crime, or if one, bad thing happens, it's gonna be my neck on the line, where all the evidence shows the opposite, that it's better for public safety to not have people cycling through prison, because then they end up becoming more violent, and their whole life is you become a second-class citizen.
How much do you feel that the private prisons play a role in this?
Yeah, that's a good question, where I think the conventional wisdom is also a bit misleading sometimes on it. Private prisons are maybe 8 to 10% of all prisons, and they're definitely a nefarious phenomenon, in general. But, I think there's a lot of other entrenched interests as well that play a similar or greater part in, the financial benefits of mass incarceration. There's so many corporations that benefit from the free prison labor inside of it. Even the non-private prisons contract out a lot of their work with companies, so the Marriott is like a huge provider of like textiles and the food, running the cafeterias, the medical, all providing all the medical care for it. Those are huge industries. And so it's just so sort of entrenched in some ways. The prison guards union, because there's been this phenomenon of most people go to prison are from poor urban areas, but or disproportionately from poor urban areas at least. And most prisons are way out in rural areas. So for a lot of small rural communities, they've become economically dependent on the jobs from the prison because they're the only jobs around. So they don't want, the politicians from those places don't want to lose the local prison because they're getting reelected depends on that, or at least they think it does. So yeah, that's why, yeah, I mean, a lot of the work is sort of on the local level, getting those politicians to realize that it's not in their self-interest,
That's
to
great advice.
keep locking up a lot of people, so many people, that they're going to be held accountable for it.
Yeah.
So I think we've taken quite a bit of your time. I really appreciate it, Jag.
I feel the same way.
Was there anything you might want to add before we wrap here?
Not much. Yeah, we went through quite a lot. Check out Drug Policy Alliance, get on our email list, drugpolicy.org, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff.
Snapchat.
We're pretty active all around the country. And we have offices in Colorado, California, New York, a lot of places, do a lot of local events and organizing. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to see all the work you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Jag.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Hope to talk to you again in the future.